long ago, Utnapishtim says, the gods decided to destroy all humans with a huge flood. And for those of us, of course, we immediately who know the biblical text think about Genesis 6 through 9, and of course the Noah flood story, right? And everybody dies, and because that's the way it's supposed to be, everyone is therefore mortal. And Utnapishtim says, me and my wife were told by the god Ea, E-A, to build this large boat. Okay, it's not actually called an ark, but a large ship. And to put a lot of animals on it, and to put craftsmen and artists on it, right? So in other words, the idea is we need to save the important things in this world. The animals that obviously can't live when water is covering the earth, and, you know, the helpers that would rebuild the world or whatever, artists, craftsmen, and the like. After the flood, Utnapishtim says, the god Enlil gave Utnapishtim and his wife immortality. Maybe you might think of it as a reward for having survived the flood, if you think about it. And then Utnapishtim says, you know what, on second thought, Gilgamesh, maybe I am ready to let you attain immortality. We're going to have this game now being played over and over again in the epic tradition. He says, I'm going to give you a test. And it's a famous test, and it's a motif that we will see again and again in famous works of literature. The test is simply, can you stay awake all night? Now, if you think about it, this makes sense, right? Think about what it is that Gilgamesh wants. He wants immortality. Well, what does that mean? He wants to never die. Well, what is dying? Well, it's kind of like going to sleep, isn't it? I mean, think about that. Death is kind of like going to sleep. So if you want to overcome death, the way you prove that is by staying awake. Now, for any of us that have kind of tried to stay awake when we really wanted to go to sleep, we know how hard that is. And immediately, of course, we can think about all the different kinds of sleep stories when you're supposed to be staying awake. Do you remember this one? Aeolus gives Odysseus the winds all in a bag. Remember this? And he says, you can get all the way to Ithaca. Dude, Odysseus gets all the way to Ithaca. So close to Ithaca, he can actually see the people on the shore. And then he has to go to sleep. He's so tired. For 9 days he sailed. He's so stinking tired. Can you imagine staying awake for 9 days? It's a very subtle notion in the Odyssey. Odysseus stayed awake for 9 days. But on the 10th day, he had to go to sleep. And the moment he goes to sleep, his warriors open up the winds, blow him all the way off course, and now it's going to be 10 years before he ever gets home. See how this works? Same gig happening, for example, in the story of Gethsemane with Jesus Christ and his followers. They go to sleep. Remember this? They can't stay awake. The dark night of the soul that we'll talk about when we do our St. Augustine and, of course, St. John of the Cross. The idea that you got to stay awake. Well, the test to stay awake in the end is one that Gilgamesh cannot do. So, in other words, he goes to sleep. He can't wake up, right? And he can't stay awake. And so in the end of the epic now, Gilgamesh fails the test, the stay awake test, okay? And Utnapishtim says, you know what, Gilgamesh, I've had enough of you, and he sends him away. By the way, he also punishes the ferryman as well, Urushamati, and says about him, you know what, I'm going to punish you as well. And so Gilgamesh and his ferryman start sailing away. Interestingly, it's Utnapishtim's wife who will have Utnapishtim call them back and say, wait, you've been a little harsh. Why don't you give him one more chance? So now we get one more chance at immortality. Hurrah, here it comes. You can kind of see Gilgamesh going, all right. I've been through enough. I've done enough. Now I get to find out how I can stay alive forever, immortality, right? Utnapishtim says, there's a plan. Now this herbal referencing will obviously sound very, very familiar. This is, of course, the Genesis account of the tree of life, if you will, right? Or, think about it, the forbidden fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We'll do all of this study in more detail when we pick up our study of Milton and Paradise Lost, right? There's this plant, right, he says, and if you can get a hold of this plant, guess where it is? At the bottom of the sea. So now we're going to have to swim down to the bottom of the sea to get this plant. But if you can get this, it will keep you alive. So Gilgamesh swims down to the bottom of the sea and he finds the plant. Hurrah! And so what does he do? Well, he eats it, obviously, and that way he stays alive forever. Interestingly, no. I mean, one of the interesting things about this, and it's not a real sophisticated poem like the Homeric epics, for example, will be, or certainly Virgil and Dante. But you do get this really interesting kind of subtle stuff going on. Why wouldn't Gilgamesh just immediately eat the plant? No, he's going to take it back to Uruk. Take it back to Uruk? Why would he do that? He's going to test it out on somebody first. So he's going to take it back to Uruk. He's going to give it to an old person and say, here, I found this dope, try this. And if it kills him, then, of course, he'll know, not going to eat the plant. On the other hand, if he keeps the old man alive, then he'll know he can use it. To that degree, he's a little kind of Odyssean, isn't he? A little bit wily. So he gets the plant, he starts heading back. Hurrah! Now all he has to do is go back and have the plant tested and everything is great. However, before he gets back to Uruk, he needs a bath. Now we immediately think, of course, of all the bathing motifs, especially when we studied our Odyssey. It seems like those guys, if they're not eating, they're bathing. And of course, if they're not eating and bathing, then they're out on the ocean doing their sailing around, etc., right? So he has to take a bath. So he takes off all his clothes, he takes this bath. Of course, he's got the plant. He leaves the plant there with his clothes, and he takes his swim, or his bath, right? Well, now we've got a very interesting part of our story. A snake shows up. Now, of course, when we study our Milton's Paradise Lost, we're going to know all about snakes because we're going to study the book of Genesis and obviously Genesis 3 and the idea of a snake who will come in and be the great tempter, okay? So the snake shows up. Guess what the snake does? Snake eats the plant. Which explains why as well that snakes seem to live forever by shedding their skin, right? See how this works. It's interesting that Gilgamesh, you would think, would be heartbroken about losing the plant. Or, you might think, he'll go back and swim down to the bottom of the ocean and find more of the same plant. I mean, that would be the assumption, right? No, not what he does. The Epic of Gilgamesh finishes with Gilgamesh coming back to the city of Uruk. This poem has a very cyclical kind of feel to it because in the opening lines of the poem we have a celebration of civilization in the city of Uruk, this great city. Think of the city of Troy when you think of this great city, right? The celebration of all civilization. And at the very end of our story, then, we'll have the celebration of the architecture and the great city of Uruk, and, significantly, reminding us of, for example, the end of both the Iliad and the Odyssey, we have no death narrative for our hero. Notice at the end of the Iliad, we don't have the death narrative of Achilles. We know that he's going to die because there's all kinds of references to it, but no death narrative. And at the end of the Odyssey, we have no death narrative of Odysseus either. We know what Tiresias tells Odysseus in the underworld. Odysseus needs to do at the end of his life, carrying his oar so far inland that people look at him and like, dude, what are you carrying on your shoulder? And that's where he's going to plant the oar, and then that will be kind of the way that he can live out his life in peace. But we have no actual death narrative of Odysseus either, just like with Gilgamesh, and that's how the poem ends. All right, let's jump really quickly to levels 2 and 3 and finish up, right? Well, one obvious message here at 2a is that you have to respect the gods or you die. Throwing a piece of meat, a bull's leg, at Ishtar is probably not the best idea. And of course, some of you will go immediately, oh yeah, that's right. Isn't it true as well that Antilochus in the Odyssey throws a leg of meat at the Odyssean character who's kind of in disguise, and it hits him and it makes him really mad, right? So we have that same game being played. Of course, we gotta say this at 2a. The hero's quest, right? How you discover who you are is through going on this long journey, this long quest, right? And time and again, we will see this. Now, sometimes that quest is a physical journey where you fight off monsters and all. Sometimes that quest is more of an intellectual or a spiritual journey. When we pick up, for example, Confessions of St. Augustine and read it, the journey is not as much a physical journey, although there is a physical component. He leaves North Africa and he goes to Milan and all that, but it's really more about a spiritual, emotional journey, right? At level 2b, well, we said we were going to talk about some symbolism. I mean, obviously, Enkidu is the symbol of the natural man. Uruk is the symbol of civilization. Obviously, the snake is the symbol of, taking away something that you want really badly or ruining it or whatever, right? The ironies involved in this text, well, the strong loner, who is Gilgamesh, longs for his equal and a friend in Enkidu, right? Which is kind of counterintuitive, and yet there it is, right? Why is it that Achilles gets so worked up about the death of Patroclus? Well, we've commented on this already, that Achilles goes through some kind of spiritual disequilibrium when he loses Patroclus. Same gig. Of course, another irony is that the snake will eat the plant of life, and now we can't have immortality. If only the snake had not eaten from the plant of life, we are still in our plant of life. All humans would have the secret of immortality, and we'd live forever. What a shame, right? At level 3A, as we relate this to other epics, I'm going to give this to you for some thought. I mean, just jot down the epics that we've already worked with: the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid. We'll now turn to Beowulf. A little later, we're going to be in Dante's Inferno. After that, we'll be in Milton's Paradise Lost. We told you at the beginning of our AP study that we concentrate a lot on these epics. In the middle of all of that, we'll do the epic tradition, if we can call it that, of the Arthurian motif. King Arthur is as well going to play this game right about the moment that it looks like the war for Arthur has come to its cessation. Guess what happens? A snake bites somebody on the ankle and immediately starts it all over again. So we're going to see this repetition of this happening. Well, there's several correspondences. Let's list them. Obviously, the hero's quest is a huge one. The struggle against gods and others, that contest or struggle, is obviously a central part of all of these different poems. Think about this one. The quest for immortality. Wasn't it Calypso on the island of Aia that will say, or the island of Oricha that will say to Odysseus, "Stay with me and be immortal"? And Odysseus turns her down in the same way that, of course, Enkidu Gilgamesh will turn down Ishtar, right? Finally, at level 3B, how are we going to relate this to our own experiences? What are your thoughts about this one? Is it a good idea to have a rival who is also a friend, who will kind of push you, right? Who kind of, students have sometimes said, there's that film called Remember the Titans, which is a wonderful Denzel Washington film. If you haven't seen it, you want to watch it. But in that film, you have the two greatest ball players who start out as enemies and then become the dearest and closest of friends. In your experience, have you found that that's the case? Qualify who's the closest person in your life and ask, is that person kind of your equal and therefore kind of challenges and pushes you? Or is there a clear superiority one way or the other? How about this one? What was the time you worked really hard to get something? Think of Gilgamesh going in search of immortality in the plant of life. And then, in kind of a silly way, you lost it. And how did you respond? Gilgamesh's response is kind of fascinating. It's almost like he's resigned to the fact that he knows he's going to have to die, but he'd rather die in his own city, and therefore he goes back home in the same way that Odysseus goes back home to Ithaca. How about this one? How about the question, if you could know the day of your death? We're going to ask this question, by the way, in our study of Dante, and then later, Jean-Paul Sartre's classic No Exit. If you could know the day of your death, let's just ask this question this way. If in our building at Worland High School there was a special room with a computer, and you walked into that room and you sat down, and on the computer screen there was a bar there. At the beginning of the bar is the moment of your birth. We won't say your conception, that's gross, but the moment of your birth. And then at the end of the bar, that's the moment of your death. Anywhere you click on the bar, you see video of that moment. So you click on it, you see any moment. So for example, you click on that one at the very beginning of the bar, you see the moment of your birth. Or you see 8th grade graduation if you click on that. Of course, if you click on the very last moment of the bar, you see the moment of your death. Would you click on that last moment of your death? Would you like to know it in advance? Or would that be for you something horrifying to know? What is your relationship in view of death and dying? Are you like Gilgamesh? Do you long for immortality? Or are you more inclined to say that the moment that you got that plant, you might let it go? Some interesting kinds of questions. Well, from here now, we turn to the study of our first Anglo-Saxon epic poem and the great epic hero Beowulf. I hope that you'll begin to see some correspondences as we get into that study as well. Thanks very much.